Good day and welcome to the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation's web talk with Dr. Asaf Romarowski. Today's presentation is part of a series on challenges for Jews today and is titled Navigating the Educational System and Academia, a timely topic as we approach the academic year. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of CAEF and co-chair of End Jew Hatred Canada, a grassroots movement dedicated to exposing Jew hatred and demanding accountability of government and institutions in taking action to punish the anti-Semites. CAEF is a registered charitable organization that focuses on education about Jew hatred and the persecution of minorities, as well as Israel's history and legal rights, and on building Jewish pride, allyship with non-Jewish organizations, and collaboration amongst Jewish organizations in common cause. We rely on donations to continue our work, so please consider making a donation online at www.caef.ca. And most importantly, share the information we produce in our CAEF bulletin and our advocacy and action. And if you wish to volunteer, please contact me directly at andrea@caef.ca. I would like to thank Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights and Toronto Jewish Advocacy and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East for co-sponsoring today's web talk. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Romarowski, Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, or SPME. He is also a senior research fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and an affiliate professor at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Middle East historian, Dr. Romarowski holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Dr. Romarowski is co-author of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief and a contributor to the Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel. He recently co-edited Word Crimes, Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, a special issue of the journal Israel Studies. I want to really draw people's attention to this concept of word crimes, which I first heard on a webinar that CPME produced. We live in a world now where words have been appropriated and misused to destructive and inhumane consequences. Words such as apartheid, occupation, settlement, Zionism, in the mouths of our enemies have no bearing on reality. Dr. Romarowski's publicly engaged scholarship has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the National Interest, the American Interest, the New Republic, the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Ynet, and Tablet, among others, online and traditional print media. While today's topic is confined to education, I invite listeners to read Asaf's work on defining who is a real Palestinian Arab refugee, on the role of the UN Relief and Works Agency, which plays into the facade of millions of refugees, which consequently aids Palestinian terrorism. This webinar is being recorded, and after the presentation, Dr. Romarowski will be happy to take your questions, so please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Asaf, thank you for joining me today. I don't think I have to tell our audience why this focus on education is so very important. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrea, appreciate the kind hospitality and the warm words. It's a pleasure to see you, at least virtually, and I hope that at some point we get to see each other again in person when we get to move around a little bit more. My comments this afternoon, Andrea asked me to talk about, about the larger understanding of the academy today, navigating the academy and the environment that we're facing. So I feel like I want to put out a few ideas that are out there that I think that are related to several disciplines, and specifically the academy at large. And then hopefully we can go into a larger Q&A. I'm happy to go into specifics. As Andrea mentioned, I come out of Middle East Studies, though my comments this afternoon, I would say, are relevant and critical to the humanities at large and the academy that we're seeing all around. I could take us back to the beginning to May during Israel's last war in Gaza against Hamas. The reaction to the Gaza War was quite telling. If anybody had any illusions about where the academy stands, I think that the Gaza event and the Gaza war pinpoints and really sheds a lot of light about the reality and about the academy at large. There have been approximately here in North America, I would say over 100 condemnations of Israel regarding and centered around all the issues that, Andrea mentioned before, the work that we produced, the joint work that I did with my colleagues on word crimes with these trigger words, words like apartheid, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, indigeneity. And part of the reason we did that project and related exactly to the comments that I'm referring to this afternoon, because we were looking to figure out, we chose these terms intentionally because we believe that every one of these terms actually has hijacked the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. And that by saying any one of these words, you basically have encapsulated the totality and the enterprise of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic without requiring any kind of explanation about what the terms actually means because of the connotations they have, I would say, in the West and in Western media for sure, and the way they are being projected all around. I would like one of the statements that came out after Gaza, I think is quite telling about the reality that we're facing. And this was a statement that was made by a group called Palestine in Praxis. And I am quoting from the statement itself. The statement, and I quote here, "The Palestine struggle as an indigenous liberation movement confronting a settler colonial state," and described Israel, and it continues, and I quote here with this continuation of the same statement, "a brute force that enshrines territorial theft and the racial supremacy of Jewish Zionist nationals." And and what's even more to the point, in as far as how this is being translated and how it was being redefined as it relates to the academy and to scholarship, the statement followed, and I think this is really the important and the kicker as it relates to the statement itself. The authors of the statement write here, and I quote, "We recognize our role and responsibility as scholars to theorize, read, and write on the very issues unfolding in Palestine among all oppressed nations today. Scholarship without action normalizes the status quo and reinforces Israel's impunity. And that we the scholars, affirm that there is no longer an acceptable conduct of research in Palestine or on the Palestinians without a clear component of political commitment." So I think that, this is quite a telling statement at large about the reality, is the fact that the university itself is no longer immune to the politicization of the academy at large. And I think that what we've seen, I would say predominantly, if I had to, pinpoint an historical time frame, since the 1960s in North America at large, we've seen a steady but really exponential growth of what I would consider to be scholar activists, individuals who've basically put aside their scholarship in lieu of what they consider to be activism. So you no longer need to rationalize anything that you do or to back it up with actual inquisitive research, but just by your sense of your activism, you are allowing yourself to actually, that replaces scholarship. This has been a very slippery slope that I see here, that we've been seeing in the academy at large. And this is the background to the environment that we're facing today. The political toxicity that we've seen within the academy at large, I think has reached a peak today. I'm sure that many of the audience has heard phrases like cancel culture, intersectionality, identity politics. These are all part of the framework of what is considered to be scholarship or quasi-scholarship, that I would consider to be, that has dictated what is acceptable conversation in the academy. The academy today is, the number one issue that is motivating the academy is something that is known as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The idea that the university as become an equalizer, or the need to make it, an equalizer for all. And so there is a growing desire by many institutions to create this need of showing equality, showing diversification. But interestingly enough, what we have seen, even though the statement states diversity, equality, and equity, it is only equality and equity for some, but not for all. And especially when it comes to the environment as it relates to Jews on campus and the war on anti-Semitism that we are seeing growing, that none of these categorizations actually see Jews fall into that categorization. Let me explain. Based on the statement that I read before about how the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic is defined as a settler colonial environment, as the fact that there's ethnic cleansing and indigeneity. There has been a parachuting of the environment in North America today onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that is something that I will get to in a few minutes, but let me try to explain how this plays out within the understanding of the academy at large. One of the number one issues of one of the more pernicious and I would say main forces that are driving a lot of the environment today on American college, North American college, talking to my Canadian friends in North America at large, and I would say in the West at large, has to do with the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, otherwise known as the BDS movement. And the number one demand of the BDS movement is something known as the anti-normalization. Anti-normalization is a critical component of this understanding. Basically, it argues that Jews are abnormal. They cannot be seen or defined as normal. Ergo, the state of Israel is an abnormal enterprise at large, and basically arguing that Zionism as the as Jewish nationalism is something that should not be accepted, should not be seen as acceptable or as legitimate at large. And so everything that the BDS movement is called for and is pushed for has to do with making Israel and Jews at large seen as abnormal. That abnormality is part of the key component of what I would say, and I would argue to be true, is the old anti-Semitic tropes of how Jews have been defined throughout the ages, from the Middle Ages all the way to contemporary anti-Semitism. But with the creation of the state of Israel, all the old anti-Semitic tropes that have been targeted at Jews have now been pinpointed at the state of Israel, starting, of course, with one of the main allegations that we see commonly spread within the entire conversation, and that, of course, is that Zionism is a form of racism, referring to the 1975 UN resolution that was later repealed in 1991. But on North American college campuses, and I would say within Western society at large, Israel is seen as a racist society, which is why you cannot go, and I would say this is true for most campuses today, without saying the word Zionism, without immediately having the connotation of racism. So Jews are racist, and actually whatever they do by extension has to do with a racist nature of the Jewish state, in specifically their conduct between Israelis and Palestinians, that it is all race by nature, and as such, it cannot be included as an inclusive liberal society, which Zionism is. But within the construct of these terms, specifically within diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what is known also as critical race theory, looking at the reality, within that framework, Jews and Israelis don't fall within that categorization because of their racist nature. And so this is what we are facing today when we're trying to make the argument for Israel. And so ergo, one has to also, if you take that understanding within that lens, what you're seeing today is that from the vantage point of Westerners, North Americans, when they have been looking at the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, and I would say specifically since the rise in America in particular of the Black Lives Matter movement, there has been a parachuting of the race paradigm in American society and Canadian society onto the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. That is to say, Israelis are white colonial individuals and Palestinians are black and brown. And so if that is the understanding of how we look at the reality, then the way we're combating racism in the United States and in North America at large, that's how we should be combating the state of Israel, because of its abnormality, it's the fact that it is not normal because of the anti-normalization and because it is racist by nature. Moreover, even more pernicious within this larger paradigm is, of course, what I would call, or not call, but what I've identified within this larger understanding is, of course, what is known to be the use of Holocaust inversion. That is to say that the metaphor has now flipped. That is to say that Palestinians are now Jews, or David in that regard, and the Israelis are now the Goliath. And the fact that anything that the state of Israel does has been clearly projected and being described within terminology of the Holocaust, because Jews are worse than Nazis, because what they're doing to Palestinians within that understanding is they are doing worse, awful things. So refugee camps are constituted as concentration camps. Every Israeli leader has been depicted in Palestinian cartoons as in SS and in Nazi uniforms. And so to argue that, of course, and this feeds into the historical narrative, by the Arab-Palestinian narrative, Israel's only existence is because of the Holocaust. To say that if there was no Holocaust, there would be no Jewish Israel in existence today. So everything that they have done, historically speaking, is to try to delineate, minimize from the impact of the Holocaust, and to basically nullify any kind of Jewish history of the Zionist movement 100 years, prior even to the, the movement, to the creation of the state of Israel. And again, even though the Holocaust was a small part of it, they totally nullify everything that happened in the Zionist movement going back to the 1800s. And so this has been a clear by design understanding in order to sell this message, in order to make sure that this is how the story of Israel is being told. So when you take this historical understanding and you put that within the academy today and within the narrative of the university today, the problem that professors were sympathetic to Israel, students were sympathetic to Israel, and when they are dealing with a narrative that is dominated by progressive values, the challenge that they have had on campus is the fact that they cannot be openly an advocate of, or even sympathetic towards the state of Israel without shedding their support of Israel or within Zionism. The idea that you cannot be pro LGBTQ rights, you cannot be pro women's rights, you cannot be for Black Lives Matter, you cannot be any progressive value that Jews believe in, or say that they believe in, if they are on the progressive side of the political coin, but without saying that they're not Zionists. And so what that happens here is that Jews and the pro-Israel community at large is forced to make a choice. Whether I am seen as a open-minded, liberal, cosmopolitan, human rights individual that cares about global rights and whatnot, or am I a Zionist? Because if I declare myself to be in support of the Zionist enterprise and sympathetic towards what's going on within Israel at large, then I'm immediately defined as a racist. Now, I will also be clear here, Israel is not perfect. And there's nothing, there's nothing about this as a mode of perfection. However, the way that Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being taught clearly in a binary way. And it's all in a very black and white environment that leaves no room for discussion, which again is a total anathema to the infrastructure of what the university should be. If you had to kind of categorize and look historically at the academy at large, I would say that maybe up until the mid-90s, you could still get a balanced understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You could get a clear understanding, of balanced syllabi within classrooms. But today, it's hard to come by. There has been an extreme politicization of what is going on in the academy, and there is little to no balance when it comes to teaching or writing about these topics at large. It used to be that you could say that within the humanity, that there was a differentiation between the humanities, where many of these theories, endless theories about many things that sometimes don't make any sense, have become fertile ground for the growth of these issues that have allowed this environment to grow. But now you're also seeing this seep into the STEM areas, where you're also seeing a hijacking of the exact sciences, where one would assume that 1 + 1 usually equals 2, but that's no longer the case when you're seeing some cases play into, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, where you're seeing accusations and growth of the boycott movement, even in those disciplines. That's another element, another telling sign about the toxicity that we're seeing today. The other part, which I think is related to the point that I was making before when I made the quote, has to do, of course, with the larger politicization of the academy. Universities in general have been what I would consider to be social indicators of society, and where society, has been, using them in order to move along in a certain trajectory. What you're seeing today is that the political environment, and specifically you saw this here in America, speaking, from my vantage point in Pennsylvania, that after the last elections, there was also a very clear seeping in of American politics into the academy. And so you also have, and I think this is also true for Canadian campuses as well, as it relates to conservative viewpoints and liberal viewpoints on a college campus. And the ratio between liberal viewpoints and conservative viewpoints today are liberal viewpoints are exponentially larger than conservative viewpoints on campuses. And so also speaks to the volume of, does balance actually exist in the academy today? Elements of what the university should be putting out there as far as educating professors and stakeholders and other individuals, but predominantly students, to critical thinking is no longer in existence. Part of the byproduct of the environment that I'm describing to you is an environment that is known as the cancel culture environment. That is to say that if you don't like something that you hear on campus, you can shut it down. Whereas, even 30 or 40 years ago, if you were on a college campus, all viewpoints were accepted. You could like it, dislike it, but you could at least hear it. Today, the tactic is, if you don't like it, then you must shut it down. And that, exactly relates to the particular environment of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. That, it's not acceptable to talk about the positive part or the elements of what Israel has given to the region. We only have to stick to the victimhood of the Palestinian narrative as it is projected through the boycott and divestment and sanction movement. So BDS is, demands the most maximalist demands possible in order to afford no room for conversation or discussion. Doesn't call for a two-state solution, doesn't call for reconciliation. It basically calls for the eradication of the state of Israel by basically pushing Israel into the sea and winning and taking over Israel by demographic means, by political means, by showing and highlighting its illegality, its abnormality, and the fact that its racist nature. Again, all of these in double quotation marks, in order to sell this narrative, to sell the a very clear black and white narrative, in order to to make clear about the side of right and righteousness, and the fact of where we stand on as far as our role in the world versus the side of wrong. Again, a very binary understanding of the issue at large. Let me also put out another, clear understanding of the issue, which is also, I think, very critical, that needs to be understood. In particular, in my area of studies, again, I come out of Middle East studies. I think that what is so disingenuous and what is so disheartening to the reality that we're facing today has to do with the fact that individuals who pride themselves on research, on understanding the culture and the language and the politics and the theology of the area, are willing to subscribe themselves and are willing to get a pass by a very simplistic narrative of the region at large. Over a year ago, Israel, signed the Abraham Accords with the Gulf states, with Morocco, and with Bahrain, and with other places. And so there's a growth of a normalization of the region between Israel and its neighbors. That kind of true factual reality of what's happening on the ground has not trickled down into the academy, which is, again, another telling sign about accepting facts versus accepting a perceived fiction or a self prophecy, projected, understanding of how the academy sees the reality on the ground and what it's willing to accept and what it's not willing to accept as it relates to the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, and how do we deal with that environment. So those are all the problems, and I know I spent a significant amount of time about the problems that we are dealing with. Now, let me talk about a little bit about some solutions or some ideas of what needs to happen, and then hopefully we can also jump into to Q&A. I can see already that people are typing in questions, and I also want to leave room for those questions as well. It's challenging, and I would be the first to admit that. The group that I had, Scholarship Peace in the Middle East, SPME, we have been working to help mobilize faculty who teach these topics how to, and usually they find themselves in the minority on their own college campuses. So what we've been working on, and what I think is also desperately needed, is helping faculty who are willing to step up and talk about actually what is happening on the ground, what they stand for, what they believe in, standing up for a lot of these issues, and being intellectually honest about what they see in the region. Requires a lot of courage, and they need support because many of them are being marginalized by their own peers, by their own institutions. They are being threatened, and the university itself has shown itself to be weak when other groups who are attacking the university are claiming that X and Y and Z individual is threatening the culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the fact as a result of that individual needs to be shut down, needs to be fired, a title needs to be taken from those individuals. Again, these are the kind of crazy accusations that are going into that. So faculty need support. Faculty need to have legal support. They need to have content support, and there needs to be courage to help them deal with their reality, within their own administrations. Something that we've been doing through SPME, as far as creating a community of scholars that are standing up for many of these fallacies. The other part, which again, you cannot forget the ingredient of students. Students who are on campus are being basically forced into this environment, and for an 18-year-old individual to stand up in a college classroom into a tenured professor requires a lot of courage. Those individuals also need to have support. They need to have the ability to show other viewpoints. They need to be able to know what kind of legal tools they have in their toolbox in order to, if they need to step up to the environment and to go with the administration and to talk about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. These are all things that both community needs as a result of that. Part of the other part, which I think is critical and something that we've been working on for the past few years, is of course creating bridges between the faculty side of things and the student body in order to create a stronger message on campus. It is healthy for the academy to have diversity of viewpoints. It is healthy for the academy to have, to agree on things and to have other viewpoints, but to be shut down and to be ostracized because of one's viewpoints is not acceptable. And I think that there's also a bigger question about the role of the university if it becomes an echo chamber only for the viewpoints that it likes, without actually having dissenting viewpoints and allowing for critical thinking and for giving tools to teach, because that is the role of the university. And so I think that's another part that we need to be talking about. The other part, no less important, which I think, I know many of you on the call are concerned about, of course, has to do with the normalization of anti-Semitism. There is a significant global growth in anti-Semitism worldwide. that has been trickling down into all facets, I would say, of, I would characterize it as areas of soft power as it relates to the West regarding journalism, the academy, the culture, and whatnot. The fact that the pro-Israel community has had in the academy specifically to make a case for both for two things. One, that Jews are minorities, and B, that anti-Semitism is racism. On those two accounts, we've had a difficult time making the case because racism has only been one thing, and anti-Semitism has not been seen as a form of racism, which is part of the challenge that we've been facing today on campus when Jews are, making the case to many of these DEI officers, these diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, about what actually racism is, and the fact that how that anti-Semitism is viewed a form of racism. And so the challenge that you're facing on many college campuses at large, and this is a phenomenon that is very well seen and observed in North America at large, is that there is a movement to say, I don't want to be seen as a racist. I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm just an anti-Zionist. So by saying I'm an anti-Zionist, I'm only a critical thinker of Israel. I'm not a racist. And so those individuals have tried to define and redefine what anti-Semitism is. I know in Canada, like in North America, many of us have adopted the IRA definition, which is extremely a positive tool in our toolbox, because again, within the IRA definition, we see the fact that forms of anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, denial of the state of Israel are indeed considered to be anti-Semitic. Those are things that we need to be highlighting for our universities. Actually, I would argue even further that the IRA definition should be adopted by universities in order to clearly define what is anti-Semitism. So when you see the problem, you can identify the problem and you come up with a solution. And I think that that's part of the challenge that we have today as a result of the IRA definition that needs to be enforced on campus. It needs to be taught. Many of the administrators and officers who are dealing with these topics need to actually get a better understanding of what the IRA definition means and to help students and faculty enforce it on college campuses at large. That's a phenomenal tool. IRA has been adopted these days by over 30 countries worldwide. And I think that is a positive at least sign that people are at least waking up as to what is going on globally when it comes to anti-Semitism. But when it comes to the academy at large, they actually need to be enforced and not to be framed within that narrative. The other challenge, of course, which I implied, but it's worth stating as well, is that many of the individuals who are on campus, who are ascribing to these viewpoints and are supporters of the boycott movement, can, and many are Jews. And so it makes it even more challenging when you say that I'm Jewish, but. And so many of the narrative is that you're fighting one another. And so there has to be a clear understanding that there are Jews who are subscribed to these viewpoints, and it's not monolithic. In contrast to the opposition, which is entirely monolithic. So part of the fragmentation that we have within the pro-Israel Jewish community is the myriad of opinions that can be anti-Semitic. And so there has to be an understanding of what exactly we're fighting and where these voices are coming from. These are the larger issues that we're seeing today, which makes the navigation of the academy at large extremely complex and extremely and requires a great deal of understanding of what we're fighting, what the problems are, and how to deal with them. I will also argue, and I think as again, not as obviously uplifting around that we need to face is, of course, the fact that these same problems that we are identifying on university levels and college levels are also now trickling down to the high school levels. And so within the high school narrative and younger ages, this kind of environment is also seeping into that conversation. So what that means is that these opinions, these ideas, these dogmatic understandings of the issue are creating an environment where these students are coming to campus with these already preconceived conclusions about the reality. And so part of also, is the education of how we're going to re-educate. Can we re-educate, and where can we create some kind of balance? And I think that these are the challenges that we're facing at large in order to stand up for this reality. Again, I think that the IRA is a good tool for us to use. I think that the anti-normalization is critical to understand how it's being used. But if you're, from my vantage points going into the fall semester now, I think we're going to face a very challenging semester as we're going forward as a result of the war in Gaza that happened in May, and giving the, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, nobody should have any illusions today, given the fact that in the United States, over 100 departments and associations all came out with statements of condemnation, not recognizing that Hamas is a terrorist organization, not recognizing what's going on in Gaza. Again, reality and the factual reality has not seeped in and is not fed into the perceived reality on college campuses. And we need to work very hard to create an understanding of the reality versus the fictional reality that is sometimes, in many places being prescribed and shared on campus. And I think that has to do with the fact, and this is another word that I've yet to use in these remarks this afternoon, has to do with the growth of identity politics. Identity politics is based on opinion, not based on fact. And the idea that people feel that it should be as such, or that it is such, because a feeling does not go well and does not gel well with the actual factual issues. And so people are entitled to their own opinions, not to their own facts. And I think that is, again, part of the role of the university to help students, especially when they come to campus, think in a critical way and to do their research. I think that when it comes to the story of Israel, the story of Zionism, we have a very good story to tell. We're not telling it well enough. We're not telling it enough, period. And individuals don't know the story. And I think that that's also part of where, as an advocate of education, that we also need to do a better job on the educational component in college, before we get to college, and all along, because people need to hear the story. And if they don't hear the story, they're going to be inundated with this toxic environment. So on that note, let me end my remarks. I know that I threw out a lot of information, and I know that there are a lot of questions coming in the chat. So I'll turn it over to Andrea, and I'll try to get to as many questions as I can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a number of prepared questions, as well as questions from the audience. I'm glad that at the end you referred to high schools. If you could just take a minute and just elaborate. One of the concerns that is behind our choosing to do this webinar is that we see this hateful rhetoric and anti-Israel ideology going into the public school system. And in Toronto in particular, we've been combating a particularly venomous program that an equity officer, no less, put forward that is pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. And I believe this has been even more elaborate in the US. Can you talk about what is happening, or do you know what's happening at the high school level, and how do we attack it? Because I think it's meaning that before the kids even get to university, they're going to be Jew haters.
Well, one of the more famous cases that took place here in North America had to do, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this, about the case study of the ethnic studies curriculum in California, which got a lot of press, where there was a totally politicized ethnic studies curriculum that was going to be parachuted and funded by California taxpayer dollars in order to teach a one-sided perspective of the issue. And of course, the politicization, the Palestinianization of that curriculum, both on the level of the people teachers who were going to teach it, and on the level of the content that they were providing to teach students with. That got, fortunately, as a result of a lot of political pressure, a lot of groups who got involved, that was shut down by the governor. But that was exemplifies exactly the kind of narrative that you're seeing. Furthermore, we're seeing a growth of CRT, critical race theory curriculums that are being offered on high school campuses, with the idea of creating this understanding of the world to students. And so they are, again, predisposed to these kind of ideas before they even get to the campuses, which is, again, to my point, my last point, the sooner we start the education, the better off we are. It cannot be that students are first facing this topic before, when they get to their freshman year on a college campus. We have an obligation, I think, in particular within the Jewish community, within the pro-Israel community, to educate our students and to know the facts. I mean, they have, and they tell the story. Again, it is a good story. It's not a perfect story, but again, the idea that it is today seen as a binary issue, as a victimizer mentality, as a good and bad issue, where Jewish kids feel embarrassed, ashamed, guilty of who they are because of the way these topics are being taught, that is the crux of the problem. And I think that all of this relates ultimately to the question, to my mind, of what I would consider to be Jewish identity at large today, where within the understanding of the ingredients of Jewish identity, Zionism used to be a critical component of that Jewish identity. Today, there's a separation of that, which leads to the environment of, I'm a cultural Jew, I'm Jewish, but I don't feel good about the Zionist part, so there's been a kind of a wedge, a growing wedge between those two elements.
One of the gentlemen has put forward this question several times, so I really will introduce it, and that is the role of Islam in generating a lot of this anti-Semitism. We don't see it as straight up as it might be. For example, I've evidence from friends who are Muslim that the mosques are teaching anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, but we don't monitor what's going on in the mosques. So at the university, and you're involved with Middle Eastern studies, our understanding is there's a lot of foreign funding in various disciplines, and some of it's probably coming from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. How much is there for being funneled through Islam, through Islamic influences into the schools and into the universities?
Millions and millions of dollars. Universities are the, let me be kind. Universities are the most profitable nonprofit there is out there. Universities do not tend to turn down monies. And there have been millions of dollars that have given by the Saudis, by other Gulf states to endow chairs, departments. And so, I say this, pretty frankly, while many philanthropic Jews have names with their names on our university buildings, the opposition has bought the education. From a cost-benefit analysis, they've done a much better job at it than we have. And so our names may be on the buildings, but the education that is being taught is entirely politicized. We are now going to be marking the 20th anniversary of 9/11. All right. Before 9/11 took place, there was literally on the books at Harvard University a proposal for a bin Laden chair. So if you need to have any kind of, illusions about what the reality and where the, the exportation of the ideology, it is clearly coming to a campus near you. And I will also tell you that many of the Palestinian groups on campus, starting from a group that maybe is lesser known. It was started back in the 60s and 70s, a group called GUPS, the General Union for Palestine Students, which was the preamble to a group called the SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine, which is operating today on campuses and are also operating under the auspices of other groups like the AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine. Many of these groups on campuses are coming with this very exact narrative. They are well funded. They are well organized, and they have a very clear, distinct message about where they want to, what they want to put out there. And so this is a challenge. I am predicting that somebody's going to ask the question, well, what about Jewish studies? Jewish studies are not necessarily always the answer. There have been actually politicized Jewish studies who are looking for a different viewpoint. Over the past few years, I will tell you that, as someone who is fighting BDS in different academic associations, that we've seen viewpoints analogous to support of BDS within those disciplines. So it's not a given. As I said before, the opposition is extremely monolithic, where we pride ourselves on diversity to no end, and that diversity at times is coming back to hurt us in many ways, shapes, or form.
I don't know if everybody's aware, but it's Jewish academics that have actually opposed IRA at various initiatives to adopt it on campus, both in Canada and abroad, and have come up with their own definition of anti-Semitism, such as in the Jerusalem Declaration. I'm not sure if everybody realizes just how divisive it is. I'd like to know what is the role.
There are two, by the way, Andrea. I would just point
Right.
out that there are two. There's a Nexus and there's a Jerusalem Declaration that were attempts to try to delineate from the impact of the IRA definition.
Right. So they're not helpful. What's the role and responsibility of university administrations and boards of governors? We're always talking about the student body and deans and departments, but the silence of the university presidents is deafening.
Look, I think that we have a responsibility. I mean, I think that stakeholders and trustees and donors need to be speaking out. I mean, I think that if you don't speak out, then things will get by. I think that we have seen some accountability in some places. There was a few lawsuits that have happened. For example, here in America, at Oberlin College, we lost a lot of money, because of what they were putting out there. Vassar is another place that had a lawsuit. NYU had lawsuits. Rutgers had lawsuits. I mean, there have been several lawsuits going around with the clear understanding of trying to hold the universities accountable by all means necessary, including legal means. And I think that money should not be given without strings anywhere. Because it's a big black hole. And so I think that has to be clear about where exactly, what is being funded and where it's being funded. But I think that unless parents and students speak out, we're going to be in this toxic environment. I mean, again, let's put it, in more blunt terms here. The basic job of a university is to keep a student safe. If they cannot keep a student safe on their campus, then they're not doing their job. I mean, and I think that this is also part of, and if there's been, and with the growth of anti-Semitic activity on college campuses, physical, verbal, virtual, and in person, these are quite telling signs.
So I would assume a board of governors sets policy, yet we never hear a word from a board of governors representative on any campus. Is that where we should be taking our fight, our recommendation for IRA adoption?
I think that the board of governors, I think they should be going to the university president. I think that, major stakeholders at universities. I think that universities will stand up if there is a threat to their pocketbooks. And I think that there is there's a clear understanding of what is accepted and what is not accepted as legitimate scholarship on college campuses.
One of the articles that's floated by a lot of us this past week, I think I received it 7 times, was called something like Tips for Students and Parents, written by Deborah Feinblum. Many of you may have seen it. It was published first in JNS. And it's an article that suggests that parents need to prepare their kids for university, that they are going to run into this anti-Semitism. And it talks about, some of the ideas you shared about preparing kids. But the parents, I would argue, are not prepared. What do you suggest is the first step? If we've got Jewish parents who don't know anything about the history of Zionism or the formation of Israel or caught up in progressive politics, how are we going to help the young people?
I agree. It's a big issue. I mean, the problem that you're facing is that most parents are not aware necessarily of the reality until they take their kid on the college tour. And then they start looking around and saying, okay, is my kid going to be safe on campus? A kind of archaic notion is that maybe 20, maybe 30 years ago, when Jewish parents went to campus and they said, oh, if there's a Hillel on campus, my kid is safe. that is no longer an accepted answer and is no longer the reality. That's one element. The other part, of course, has to do with the fact that many parents and many grandparents want to send their kids to their alma maters and to make sure that they receive the same kind of education they receive. The problem is that that institution may not be the same institution they graduated from, and you got to do your homework. I mean, the same way that I don't think anybody on this call or anybody else would buy a house, maybe today given the market, without any kind of inspection. You should not go to any university without doing your homework. I mean, everything is public. One should look at events on campus, Google every campus and where you're going from, and to see what kind of environment you're facing. I will say that's it's easier said than done, because I do not believe that there is a campus today that is immune to any of this reality. This environment that I've described to you this afternoon is religion on campus. This is the religiosity of the campus environment. And I think that knowing that means going to campus not with your blinders on, but actually being aware of how to combat and how to deal with this environment and being prepared to deal with that environment, which, Andrea, relates to your first point about the fact that there is a need for much more better education for students, for parents, before they get to campus, and to being much more, to being better consumers of the product that the university is selling, but they got to be much more skeptical of what is being told them about what the product is, to say the least, before they buy into it.
You mentioned various student organizations that have Islamic connections. Maybe you could talk a little more about any strategy for dealing with these organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine. And I think in Canada, we have Human Rights in Palestine, the Muslim Student Association. Are there any examples where these organizations have been shut down? We know that recently a motion at one of the leading universities in Canada was brought to the student body to actually delist Jewish Zionist organizations. So they're taking that kind of action. That's pretty bold. What is being done on the other side to try to delist these anti-Semitic Muslim organizations?
They're smart about it. I mean, their attempt to delist these or remove their accreditation has to do with the fact of what I was saying in my earlier remarks, that they see Zionism as racism. So if university is not going to tolerate racism, how are we tolerating, these so-called racist groups on campus? Again, that's part of the farce and part of the fallacy that is being used. Here in America, we have seen student groups who have been pushed out of campus or their accreditation being lost, specifically at NYU. There was a case study there given their actions, but they were again allowed to be recredited again after they'd gone through some kind of sensitizing process. The SJP has ties to active terrorist organizations. So is the Muslim Student Association, so is WAMI and other groups. You can Google and connect the dots between many of these groups on campus. I don't think it's acceptable, to my mind at least, to allow for active terrorists to open on college campuses. On the faculty side of things, we know of cases like the Sami Elarian case, who was funneling money for the PFLP and University of Florida. There have been members, a case that I exposed back in 2004, where there was a Fulbright member, a Fulbright recipient who was a member of Hamas in a university in Florida. So these examples exist. Actually, and what's interesting is that many of the individuals who are involved in foreign terrorist organizations got their start with Palestinian student groups on campuses. And so I think that this is part of what needs to be looked at and exposed as far as the rhetoric, as far as what's going on, as far as real dialogue versus fallacious dialogue, and as far as the content that they're putting out there. The challenge is, of course, to, as always, follow the money. And I think that is harder at times if these groups are recipients of a larger pool of money, and you have to figure out exactly where the money is coming from. But one needs to do that in order to gather enough evidence in order to show exactly the connection. And I think that that's critical and is an important tactic to use.
So I should just let people know that in Canada, we at CAEF have in fact reported some incidents, some organizations to the police when individual organizations or their spokespeople have been shown to be supporting terrorism or having been funded. There are a number of organizations here that are connected with Samadan, for example, which is a listed terrorist organization in Israel and part of the PFLP. So we have reported it. We don't see that much is being done. In the US, you have now I've forgotten what title you use for the act, but the last government put in place an act that you could cut funding to universities under certain circumstances. Has that
Title VI.
Right? Has that been enacted, or has there been a follow-up, and any universities or schools been affected by it?
Some monies were shut down. I mean, again, there is a question, related to the Title VI, has to do with the question of what is known as the study of the funding of area studies, including Middle East studies. And if you're getting federal dollars and you're putting out propaganda with federal dollars, there was a case in UNC Duke where monies were shut down and were being exposed. The executive order the Trump administration, signed is still indeed in effect, but I can't predict what it's going to happen under the current administration. Title VI is not a new thing. I've been involved in advocating for Title VI for at least 20 years now, and I think that the question of seeing Jews as minorities on campus, and the fact that and discrimination that is based on nationality, origin, and religion, these are all part of the debates that are happening, as far as how Jews are looked at on campus. Title VI is a very positive and useful tool in our toolbox. The question is, even though it's on paper, is the implementation. And this is where I've taken, issue with, as far as the fact that the individuals who need to implement Title VI on American college campuses are not that always well versed with all the aspects of the bill itself and what it constitutes. And so, again, related to the IRA definition, that too, can they identify anti-Semitism when they see it on campus? And what are the actions they need to take? That's part of where the work needs to happen, vis-a-vis the fact that the individuals who are supposedly supposed to enforce these regulations, they themselves need to be educated to what the problems are.
Asif, this will probably be the last question. A lot of people have said over the years that one of the key tools to ending anti-Semitism or combating it is teaching Holocaust education. I've recently read Ruth Lee's book, I'm sure you're familiar with it more than most people, on how the teaching of Holocaust education itself has failed. Can you talk about whether you see this as part of the solution? How could it be done better, differently, or not at all to make a difference in reducing anti-Semitism?
Look, I think that Holocaust education is part of Jewish history. I think that, to my mind, there's no anchors, historical anchors in the, within the younger generation. This is the last generation where you were going to have Holocaust survivors to be able to say, I saw, I know, I was there. And so a lot of the history that's going to be taught is going to be some kind of oral history or some kind of visual history, the Holocaust museums and whatnot. It is one component of this. It is not the full remedy to the larger problem. I mean, I think that, at times, an observation that I would make, people teach the Holocaust and they end the teaching in 1945, and then suddenly everything related to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic or the Arab-Israeli conflict becomes a factor of current events. As an historian, you cannot teach history as a factor of current events. It is ludicrous. And so the idea that you need to actually know the history, understand the history, understand all aspects of it, is something that I think is what people need to know. Otherwise, they're going to be relying on social media, 140 character tweets, Facebook postings, or TikToks in order to extrapolate an entire swatch of history. And that's not good for anybody.
I want to thank you very much for your time today and thank everybody that's joined us and for all your questions. We have recorded the questions in the chat and we'll share that with Asif and maybe get back to all of you with some answers. I'm sorry we don't have more time. I want to wish everybody a good Yontif and stay well. Take care. Thanks again. Bye.
Thanks for the hospitality. Take care.
Bye-bye.